Marcus Thompson stumbled out of the Red Lion pub on Parliament Street, his vision slightly blurred from the 6 pints of bitter he'd consumed since breakfast. The 34-year-old software engineer from Phoenix had been in London for 3 days, celebrating what he called his freedom tour following a messy divorce that had cost him half his assets and his suburban home. The October morning air felt sharp against his flushed face as he pulled out his phone to check the time. 11:47 a.m. Perfect timing for more sightseeing, he thought, though his definition of sightseeing had become increasingly loose since arriving in the UK. His original plan had been simple: visit the Tower of London, see Big Ben, maybe catch a show in the West End. Instead, he'd spent most of his time moving between pubs, drowning his sorrows in warm beer and complaining to anyone who would listen about his ex-wife Sarah and her bloodsucker lawyer. The divorce had been finalized just 2 weeks ago, and this trip was supposed to be therapeutic. So far, therapy looked a lot like day drinking and sending angry texts to his buddy Jake back home about how expensive everything was in London. Marcus had always been what his friends charitably called passionate when he drank. His temper, usually kept in check by his methodical programmer's mind, became unpredictable after a few drinks. Sarah had learned this the hard way during their 7-year marriage, though she'd never called it abuse, just Marcus being Marcus when he's had too many. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but Marcus knew the truth. She'd gotten tired of his outbursts, his increasing reliance on alcohol to deal with work stress, and his tendency to blame everyone else for his problems. Now, standing on the sidewalk with tourists streaming past him toward Westminster, Marcus felt that familiar anger bubbling up again. Everything in this city was overpriced, the weather was terrible, and the people were pretentious. He'd paid £12 for a sandwich yesterday that would have cost him $4 in Phoenix. Highway robbery, he'd muttered to himself, conveniently forgetting that he was in a different country with a different economy. He decided to walk toward Buckingham Palace, partly because it was free and partly because he had a vague notion of seeing something genuinely British before his flight home tomorrow. The walk would also help him sober up a bit before his next stop, though he hadn't quite decided where that would be. Maybe another pub, maybe a coffee shop, maybe just back to his cramped hotel room to sleep off the hangover that was starting to creep in around the edges of his consciousness. The streets were busier than he'd expected for a Tuesday morning. Tourists moved in clusters, following guides with colorful umbrellas held high, while locals hurried past with the practiced efficiency of people who had somewhere important to be. Marcus found their pace annoying. Everyone was always rushing in this city, he thought, never taking time to appreciate anything. Not like Phoenix, where people knew how to relax, where a man could drink a beer on his porch without judgment, where ex-wives didn't take half of everything you'd worked for. As he walked, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his sister Jenny. "How's London? Hope you're having fun and staying out of trouble." He started to type back something about the weather being garbage and the beer being warm, then deleted it. Jenny had been supportive during the divorce, listening to his complaints and offering her guest room when he needed to get out of the house. But even she had started to suggest maybe he should talk to someone about his drinking and his anger. Maybe cut back a little, take some time to work on himself. The suggestion had annoyed him then, and annoyed him now. He stopped at a street corner, waiting for the light to change, and noticed a small coffee cart with a cheerful Pakistani man serving hot drinks to a growing line of customers. The smell was inviting, rich and caffeinated, exactly what he needed to clear his head. Marcus joined the queue, fishing his wallet out of his jacket pocket and trying to calculate the exchange rate in his head. Even the coffee was probably going to cost him a fortune here. "What can I get you, mate?" the vendor asked when Marcus reached the front of the line. His accent was thick but friendly, his smile genuine despite the early morning rush. "Just a large coffee," Marcus said, then added, "black, no sugar," because he'd learned that British coffee shops had a tendency to add things he didn't want. "That'll be £3.50, the vendor said, already reaching for a large cup. Marcus's jaw tightened. Nearly $5 for a cup of coffee. Back home, he could get coffee and a donut for less than that. He handed over a £5 note, took his change, and accepted the steaming cup with a grunt that might have been thanks. The vendor's smile faltered slightly, but he was already turning to the next customer. The coffee was actually quite good, Marcus had to admit as he continued walking toward Buckingham Palace. Strong, hot, exactly what he needed. He could feel it working already, cutting through the alcohol fog in his brain and sharpening his focus. Maybe the day wouldn't be a complete waste after all. Maybe he could actually see some sights, take some photos to show Jake that he'd done more than just drink his way through London. The palace came into view as he rounded a corner, its imposing facade gleaming in the weak October sun. Even in his current state, Marcus felt a grudging appreciation for the architecture, the sense of history and tradition that seemed to emanate from the building. This was the kind of thing Sarah would have loved, he thought bitterly. She'd always been interested in history, dragging him to museums and historic sites during their vacations while he'd preferred beaches and bars. A crowd had gathered near the palace gates, and Marcus could see the distinctive red uniforms and tall black hats of the Queen's Guard. Even he knew about the guards, everyone did. The stoic soldiers who stood perfectly still no matter what happened around them, a living symbol of British tradition and discipline. He'd seen them in movies and on television, always maintaining their composure while tourists tried unsuccessfully to get them to crack a smile or break character. As he approached the crowd, Marcus finished his coffee and looked around for a trash bin. The nearest one was several yards away, near a group of tourists who were taking pictures with their phones and chattering in what sounded like German. He considered walking over to dispose of his cup properly, then decided it wasn't worth the effort. He was on vacation, after all. Someone else could clean up after him for once. The guard closest to where Marcus stood was young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of extensive military training. His face was completely impassive, staring straight ahead as if the crowd of tourists around him simply didn't exist. Marcus found himself studying the man, wondering what he was thinking, whether he was bored or focused or just trying to get through another day of what must be an incredibly tedious job. Bet he makes more money than I do, Marcus muttered to himself, thinking about his own salary and the recent hit it had taken from divorce lawyer fees. Standing around in a costume all day while people take pictures. Probably gets full benefits too. The thought irritated him more than it should have. Here was this guy, probably barely out of his teens, getting paid to essentially be a tourist attraction while Marcus worked 60-hour weeks debugging code and dealing with impossible deadlines. And now, thanks to Sarah and her lawyers, Marcus was working harder than ever just to maintain the lifestyle he'd built before the divorce. He took another sip of his coffee and realized the cup was empty. The caffeine had definitely helped, but the alcohol was still there, lurking beneath the surface and making his thoughts darker than they needed to be. He should probably eat something, find a proper restaurant and have a decent meal. Soak up the remaining alcohol, clear his head completely, maybe even enjoy the rest of his day. Instead, he found himself moving closer to the guard, drawn by the same fascination that seemed to attract all the other tourists. There was something almost hypnotic about the man's absolute stillness, his complete dedication to his role despite the chaos of cameras and conversations swirling around him. Marcus had never been able to maintain that kind of focus, that kind of discipline. Even at work, his mind wandered, especially when things got stressful. A group of teenagers pushed past him, laughing and trying to position themselves for a selfie with the guard in the background. One of them, a boy with an expensive camera hanging around his neck, accidentally bumped into Marcus, causing him to stumble slightly. "Watch it," Marcus snapped, louder than he'd intended. The boy looked startled and mumbled an apology in accented English before hurrying away with his friends. Marcus immediately felt foolish for his reaction, but the damage was done. Several other tourists had noticed the interaction, and he could feel their eyes on him. Great, he thought. Now I'm that guy. The ugly American tourist making a scene. His embarrassment quickly transformed into resentment, as it often did when he'd been drinking. Why should he apologize for standing his ground? The kid had bumped into him, after all. If people couldn't watch where they were going, they deserved to be called out on it. Back in Phoenix, he wouldn't have to put up with this kind of behavior. People there had better manners, more respect for personal space. The guard, of course, hadn't reacted to any of it. His expression remained perfectly neutral, his gaze fixed on some distant point that only he could see. Marcus found this lack of response somehow irritating. Here was a man who was paid to ignore everything happening around him, while Marcus had to deal with rude tourists and overpriced everything and the constant reminder that his life back home was falling apart. He realized he was still holding the empty coffee cup and looked around again for a trash bin. The nearest one still seemed impossibly far away, and the crowd between him and it had only gotten denser. More tourists were arriving every minute, creating a steady stream of chatter in dozens of languages. Marcus felt claustrophobic suddenly, hemmed in by strangers who all seemed to be having a better time than he was. The coffee cup was getting warm in his hand, and he could feel the last few drops of liquid sloshing around in the bottom. He needed to get rid of it, but the crowd was making that simple task unreasonably difficult. Everything in this city was making simple tasks difficult, he thought. Even throwing away trash had become a complicated ordeal. A woman with a large handbag pushed past him without so much as an "excuse me," and Marcus felt his temper spike again. The combination of alcohol, caffeine, jet lag, and general frustration with his situation was creating a volatile mix in his brain. He needed to get away from all these people, find somewhere quiet where he could think clearly and maybe figure out what he was going to do with the rest of his life. But first, he needed to deal with this coffee cup. Such a small thing, really, but it had become symbolic of everything that was wrong with this trip, this city, this entire situation he'd found himself in. He looked at the guard again, standing there so perfectly still, so completely unbothered by the chaos around him. What would it take, Marcus wondered, to get a reaction out of someone like that? What would it take to make him break character, to prove that underneath that uniform and training, he was just another person with the same frustrations and annoyances as everyone else? The thought was dangerous, and somewhere in the part of his mind that was still sober, Marcus recognized it as such. But that part of his mind was getting smaller and quieter with each passing minute, overwhelmed by the alcohol and anger and the growing sense that nothing in his life was going the way it was supposed to go. He stood there in the crowd, holding his empty coffee cup and staring at the motionless guard, while around him hundreds of tourists continued their cheerful exploration of one of London's most famous landmarks. None of them could have predicted what was about to happen, least of all Marcus himself. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard, and Marcus Thompson made a decision that would change everything. The coffee cup felt heavier in Marcus's hand as he stood there, watching the guard's unwavering stance. Around him, the tourist crowd had swelled to nearly 100 people, all eagerly snapping photos and chattering about the famous British tradition they were witnessing. Marcus could hear fragments of conversations in multiple languages, excited children asking their parents questions, tour guides explaining the history of the Queen's Guard, teenagers making jokes about the tall furry hats. But Marcus wasn't really listening anymore. The alcohol in his system had reached that dangerous tipping point where his inhibitions began to dissolve while his anger remained fully intact. The empty coffee cup in his hand had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with his life, and the stoic guard in front of him represented everything he resented about authority, discipline, and people who seemed to have their lives figured out. Guard James Morrison, 23 years old and originally from Manchester, had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours. This was his second year with the Queen's Guard, and he'd grown accustomed to the curious stares, the constant photography, and the occasional tourist who tried to get him to break character. He'd been trained to ignore all external distractions, to maintain his position and bearing regardless of what happened around him. It was a matter of professional pride, military discipline, and respect for the centuries-old tradition he was upholding. Morrison had joined the army straight out of school, drawn by the structure and purpose it provided after a chaotic adolescence marked by his father's alcoholism and his parents' bitter divorce. The military had given him direction, confidence, and a sense of belonging he'd never experienced before. Being selected for the Queen's Guard was an honor he didn't take lightly. It meant he was representing not just himself or his regiment, but the entire British monarchy and everything it stood for. He could see the American tourist out of the corner of his eye, could sense the man's agitation even without looking directly at him. Morrison had learned to read crowd dynamics during his training, to identify potential troublemakers before they became actual problems. This particular tourist had all the warning signs: unsteady posture suggesting alcohol consumption, aggressive body language, and the kind of focused attention that usually preceded some kind of disruption. But Morrison's training had prepared him for this. He'd dealt with drunk tourists before, people who thought the guards were fair game for harassment because they weren't supposed to react. Some tried to get them to laugh, others attempted to startle them, and a few had even become physically aggressive. In every case, Morrison had maintained his composure, trusting that the plainclothes security officer's position throughout the crowd would intervene if necessary. Marcus, however, was operating beyond the reach of rational thought. The combination of alcohol, jet lag, emotional exhaustion from his divorce, and the general frustration of being in an unfamiliar place had created a perfect storm in his mind. The guard's professional demeanor, which was meant to inspire respect and admiration, instead struck Marcus as smug superiority. Here was someone who got paid to stand around and look important while real people dealt with real problems. The coffee cup seemed to pulse in his hand, warm and slightly sticky from the residual liquid. Marcus looked around one more time for a trash bin, but the crowd had shifted and moved, creating an even more complex maze of bodies between him and any reasonable disposal option. The simple act of throwing away his trash had become an insurmountable obstacle, just like everything else in his life lately. "Screw it," he muttered under his breath, loud enough that a middle-aged woman standing nearby glanced at him nervously. What happened next would be replayed countless times in security footage, witness statements, and, eventually, court proceedings. Marcus drew his arm back and hurled the coffee cup directly at guard Morrison with the kind of force that comes from months of accumulated rage and frustration. The cup hit the guard squarely in the chest, the remaining drops of coffee splashing across his pristine red uniform and leaving a dark stain that would be impossible to miss. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and dramatic. Gasps of shock and outrage erupted from dozens of tourists who had witnessed the incident. Cameras that had been casually recording the guard suddenly swung toward Marcus, capturing his face and the immediate aftermath of his action. Several people began shouting in various languages, some at Marcus, some calling for security, others simply expressing their disbelief at what they'd just seen. Morrison, to his immense credit, barely flinched. The impact of the cup had surprised him, but his training kicked in immediately. He didn't break his stance, didn't turn to look at his attacker, didn't even acknowledge that anything had happened. The coffee stain spread across his uniform like a badge of dishonor, but his face remained impassive, his gaze fixed straight ahead as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But, while Morrison maintained his professional composure, the rest of the royal security apparatus sprang into action with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Within seconds, two plainclothes officers were moving through the crowd toward Marcus, their eyes locked on the man who had just committed what amounted to an assault on a member of the Queen's Guard. Marcus, for his part, seemed momentarily stunned by his own actions. The alcohol-fueled rage that had driven him to throw the cup was immediately replaced by a creeping sense of dread as he realized what he'd just done. The crowd around him was staring, phones were recording, and he could see official-looking people moving in his direction with obvious intent. "Sir, I need you to come with me," said Detective Inspector Sarah Clark, one of the plainclothes officers who had reached Marcus first. Her voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority that cut through the crowd noise. She was in her early 40s, with 20 years of experience in law enforcement, and she'd seen enough incidents like this to know how to handle them efficiently. Marcus looked at her with a mixture of confusion and growing panic. What? "I just threw away my trash," he said, his words slightly slurred and his reasoning clearly impaired. "Sir, you assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard," Clark replied, her tone remaining professional. "I need you to come with me now for questioning." The word assault seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his alcohol-clouded mind, he hadn't thrown the cup at a person, he'd thrown it at a symbol, a uniform, a representation of everything that was frustrating him about this trip and his life in general. The fact that there was an actual human being inside that uniform, someone with feelings and dignity and a job to do, hadn't really registered. "That's not. I didn't assault anyone," Marcus protested, his voice rising and attracting even more attention from the surrounding tourists. "It was just a coffee cup. It was empty." Clark's partner, Detective Constable Mark Stevens, had positioned himself on Marcus's other side, effectively boxing him in without making it obvious to the crowd that an arrest was taking place. Stevens was younger, in his late 20s, but he'd been specially trained for tourist area incidents and knew the importance of handling these situations with minimal disruption to the hundreds of innocent visitors who were trying to enjoy their day. The contents of the cup aren't relevant, sir, Clark explained patiently. You threw an object at a member of the guard, which constitutes assault under British law. I'm going to need you to come with us. Marcus looked around desperately, suddenly, aware that dozens of people were watching this interaction with fascination. Some were still recording with their phones, others were whispering to each other in languages he couldn't understand. A few looked sympathetic, but most seemed to regard him with a mixture of disgust and curiosity, like he was some kind of zoo animal that had acted out unexpectedly. The reality of his situation began to penetrate the alcoholic fog in his brain. He was in a foreign country, he'd just attacked someone in what was probably a very public and well-monitored area, and he was about to be arrested by British police officers. The vacation that was supposed to help him forget his problems had just created an entirely new category of problems he'd never imagined. Look, I'm sorry, he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. I've had a few drinks, and I'm going through a divorce, and I wasn't thinking clearly. Can't we just forget this happened? Clark had heard variations of this speech hundreds of times during her career. The apologetic drunk tourist who thought their personal problems exempted them from the consequences of their actions was a familiar figure in London, especially around major attractions like Buckingham Palace. She felt a certain sympathy for Marcus. Clearly he was going through a difficult time, but that didn't change what he'd done or what needed to happen next. I understand you're having a difficult time, sir, she said, her voice softening slightly. But I can't just ignore what happened here. You've committed a criminal offense in full view of numerous witnesses, and it's been recorded by security cameras. We need to process this properly. The mention of security cameras sent another jolt of panic through Marcus. He'd been so focused on the immediate moment that he hadn't considered the broader implications of his actions. If this incident was recorded, it could end up online, it could affect his job, his already complicated relationship with his ex-wife, his standing in his community back home. The simple act of throwing away a coffee cup, or what had started as throwing away a coffee cup, was rapidly expanding into a nightmare scenario he couldn't have imagined. Meanwhile, Guard Morrison continued to stand at his post, the coffee stain on his uniform serving as the only visible evidence of what had transpired. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario, and he was handling it with the professionalism that made the Queen's Guard legendary. But, beneath his stoic exterior, Morrison was human, and he was processing the incident emotionally as well as professionally. Being attacked while on duty, even with something as harmless as an empty coffee cup, was a violation that went beyond the physical act itself. Morrison took pride in his role, in the tradition he was upholding, in the respect the position commanded from visitors around the world. Having someone treat him as a target for their personal frustrations was deeply demoralizing, though he would never show it while on duty. Other members of the guard had been alerted to the incident through their communication system, and additional security personnel were moving into position to ensure that the situation remained under control. The tourist crowds were being subtly managed and redirected to prevent the kind of chaos that could turn a single incident into a larger public safety issue. As Clark and Stevens began to escort Marcus away from the crowd, he made one last desperate attempt to minimize what had happened. It was just a coffee cup, he repeated, his voice now carrying a note of genuine desperation. An empty coffee cup. Nobody got hurt. This is crazy. But, even as he said it, Marcus knew it wasn't true. He could see the stain on Morrison's uniform, could see the faces of the tourists around him, could feel the weight of the officers' hands on his arms as they guided him toward their vehicle. Someone had gotten hurt, maybe not physically, but in ways that were harder to quantify and, potentially more lasting. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama subsided, but the incident had left its mark on everyone who witnessed it. Parents used it as a teaching moment for their children about respecting authority and controlling one's temper. Tour guides incorporated it into their narratives about the challenges faced by the Queen's Guard. And, somewhere in the digital cloud, videos of Marcus throwing the coffee cup were already beginning their journey toward viral infamy. As Marcus was placed in the back of an unmarked police car, his head finally beginning to clear from the shock of what he'd done, he caught one last glimpse of Guard Morrison through the window. The young soldier remained at his post, professional and dignified despite the coffee stain that marked him as the victim of an unprovoked attack. The car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, carrying Marcus toward a reckoning with the British justice system that would prove far more severe than anything he could have imagined when he'd stumbled out of the pub that morning. The Belgravia police station was a far cry from the tourist-friendly London that Marcus had been experiencing for the past 3 days. Located just 15 minutes from Buckingham Palace, the Victorian-era building housed one of the Metropolitan Police's busiest stations, dealing with everything from petty theft to international incidents involving foreign nationals. As Detective Inspector Clark led Marcus through the front doors, the reality of his situation began to settle in with crushing clarity. The booking process was methodical and humiliating. Marcus's personal belongings were catalogued and stored, his wallet containing his driver's license and credit cards, his iPhone with a cracked screen from when he'd dropped it outside a pub the day before, his passport bearing the stamps of his arrival at Heathrow just 72 hours earlier, and the remainder of his British currency, about £37 that represented what was left of the 200 he'd exchanged at the airport. Sergeant David Hughes, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, processed Marcus with the efficient detachment of someone who'd seen hundreds of similar cases. Americans who got drunk and caused trouble weren't particularly unusual in London, though attacking a member of the Queen's Guard was definitely on the more serious end of the spectrum. Marcus James Thompson, age 34, software engineer from Phoenix, Arizona, Hughes read from Marcus's passport information. "Is that correct, sir?" Marcus nodded, his mouth dry and his hands shaking slightly. The adrenaline from the incident had worn off, leaving him with a pounding headache and a growing sense of dread about what was going to happen next. The alcohol in his system was making it difficult to think clearly, but he was sober enough to understand that he was in serious trouble. "You're being held on suspicion of assault against a member of the Queen's Guard," Hughes continued, his tone neutral and professional. "You have the right to remain silent, though it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" The words washed over Marcus like a cold wave. This wasn't like American television shows where suspects got read their Miranda rights and, then, spent a few hours in holding before posting bail. This was the British legal system, and he was a foreign national who had just committed what they clearly considered a serious crime. The mention of court proceedings sent another spike of panic through his already overwrought nervous system. "I understand," he managed to say, though he wasn't sure he understood anything anymore. "Do you wish to contact the American embassy?" Hughes asked, following the standard protocol for foreign nationals. Marcus hesitated. Contacting the embassy felt like admitting that this was real, that he couldn't just talk his way out of this situation and be on his flight home the next day. But the alternative, facing the British legal system without any support, seemed even more terrifying. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I need to call them." While Marcus was being processed, the incident at Buckingham Palace was generating ripples that extended far beyond the immediate scene. The security footage had been reviewed and copied, witness statements were being collected from tourists who had seen the attack, and Guard Morrison had been temporarily relieved from his post to provide his own account of what had happened. Morrison sat in a small office within the palace security complex, still wearing his stained uniform, speaking with Inspector Davies from the Royal Protection Unit. Despite his professional training, the young guard was clearly shaken by what had happened. Being attacked while on duty, even with something as seemingly harmless as a coffee cup, represented a serious breach of the respect and security that surrounded the monarchy. "Can you describe the suspect's behavior leading up to the incident?" Davies asked, taking detailed notes for what would eventually become part of the prosecution's case. "He'd been standing in the crowd for about 10 minutes, Morrison replied, his voice steady despite the stress of the situation. "I could see him peripherally, he seemed agitated, unsteady on his feet. He kept staring directly at me, which isn't unusual with tourists, but there was something different about his attention. More focused, more aggressive." Davies nodded, making notes. "Did you perceive him as intoxicated?" "Yes, sir. His posture, his movements, the way he was holding himself, all consistent with someone who'd been drinking. I've seen enough drunk tourists to recognize the signs." The inspector finished his notes and looked up at Morrison. "This will likely go to trial, James. Are you prepared to testify about what happened?" Morrison straightened slightly, his military bearing reasserting itself. Absolutely, sir. Whatever's needed to ensure this is handled properly. Back at the police station, Marcus was learning about the complexities of international legal procedures. The duty solicitor assigned to his case, Patricia Wells, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in representing foreign nationals caught up in the British legal system. She'd seen cases like this before: Americans who thought their tourist status would protect them from serious consequences for behavior they'd never consider acceptable in their home country. The charge is assault, Wells explained, sitting across from Marcus in a small interview room. Under the Criminal Justice Act, throwing an object at someone with intent to cause harm or alarm constitutes assault, regardless of whether actual physical injury occurs. The fact that the victim was a member of the Queen's Guard may be considered an aggravating factor. Marcus's head was swimming. The legal terminology was confusing enough, but the implications were starting to become clear. This wasn't going to be resolved with an apology and a fine. This was a criminal matter that could result in a permanent record, potential jail time, and consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. "What kind of sentence are we talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "For a first offense, potentially a fine and community service, possibly a short custodial sentence," Wells replied. "But, as a foreign national, there's also the possibility of deportation and a ban on re-entering the UK. The Crown Prosecution Service takes attacks on royal personnel very seriously." The mention of deportation and a permanent ban sent Marcus into a fresh spiral of panic. He'd never been in trouble with the law before: a few speeding tickets, nothing more serious than that. The idea that one moment of drunken stupidity could result in being banned from an entire country seemed surreal. Meanwhile, at the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, Consul James Mitchell was reviewing the preliminary report of Marcus's arrest. These kinds of incidents weren't uncommon. Americans getting into trouble abroad was a regular part of the embassy's workload. But attacking a member of the Queen's Guard was particularly problematic, both legally and diplomatically. Mitchell had been with the State Department for 15 years, and he'd handled everything from passport thefts to major international incidents. He understood that while the embassy could provide assistance and ensure that Marcus received fair treatment under British law, they couldn't and wouldn't try to get him out of the consequences of his actions. The consul made a note to contact Marcus's family, his sister Jenny, who was listed as his emergency contact, and to assign a consular officer to monitor the case and ensure that Marcus's rights as an American citizen were protected throughout the legal process. Back at the police station, Marcus was struggling to comprehend the speed with which his life was unraveling. 24 hours ago, his biggest worry had been whether to have fish and chips or curry for dinner. Now he was sitting in a British jail cell, facing criminal charges that could destroy his career and his future. The cell was small and Spartan: a narrow bed, a toilet, and nothing else. The walls were painted institutional green, and the only light came from a fluorescent fixture protected by a metal grate. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, holding his head in his hands, trying to process what had happened and figure out how he was going to explain this to his boss, his family, and himself. His phone call to his sister had been one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Jenny's initial concern had quickly turned to disbelief and, then, to disappointment as Marcus explained what had happened. She'd promised to contact a lawyer in Phoenix and to wire money for his legal expenses, but her tone had made it clear that she was as shocked by his behavior as everyone else. "Marcus, how could you be so stupid?" she'd asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "Throwing something at a guard? What were you thinking?" The truth was, he hadn't been thinking at all. The combination of alcohol, emotional distress from his divorce, and the general frustration of being in an unfamiliar place had created a perfect storm that had overwhelmed his normal judgment and self-control. But explaining that to Jenny, or to anyone else, didn't make it any less serious or any less his fault. As the hours passed, Marcus began to understand that this incident was going to have consequences far beyond whatever legal punishment he might face. Word was already spreading through social media. Several tourists had posted videos of the incident online, and it was beginning to generate the kind of negative attention that could affect his job, his reputation, and his relationships back home. His employer, a mid-sized software company in Phoenix, had a strict policy about employees whose actions reflected poorly on the company. Getting arrested for attacking a member of the Queen's Guard was exactly the kind of international incident that could result in immediate termination, regardless of the eventual legal outcome. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he'd come to London to escape the consequences of his divorce, only to create an entirely new set of problems that would follow him for years to come. The therapeutic vacation that was supposed to help him start fresh had instead provided him with a criminal record and a cautionary tale about the dangers of drinking too much in foreign countries. As night fell over London, Marcus lay on the narrow jail cell bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine how he was going to rebuild his life after this disaster. Outside, the city continued its normal routine: tourists visiting attractions, guards standing their posts, and ordinary people going about their business without any idea that a simple moment of bad judgment could change everything. The next morning would bring his appearance before a magistrate, the beginning of formal legal proceedings, and the start of a process that would test every aspect of his character and resilience. But, for now, Marcus Thompson lay alone in a British jail cell, contemplating the wreckage of his life and wondering how a single coffee cup had destroyed everything he'd worked to build. The Westminster Magistrates' Court was an imposing modern building that processed thousands of cases each year, from minor infractions to serious criminal matters. As Marcus stood in the dock 3 days after his arrest, wearing the same clothes he'd had on when he threw the coffee cup, he felt smaller and more insignificant than he'd ever felt in his life. The courtroom was filled with the quiet efficiency of British justice, court clerks organizing paperwork, legal professionals conferring in hushed tones, and a public gallery containing a handful of journalists who'd picked up the story of the American tourists' attack on the Queen's Guard. Magistrate Eleanor Hartwell, a woman in her early 60s with over 2 decades of judicial experience, reviewed the case file with the methodical attention to detail that had made her one of the most respected members of the London magistracy. She'd seen hundreds of cases involving intoxicated tourists, but attacks on royal personnel were relatively rare and always treated seriously by the courts. Marcus's solicitor, Patricia Wells, had spent the previous day preparing her client for this moment. She'd reviewed the evidence, the witness statements, and the security footage, all of which painted a clear picture of what had happened. There was no question about Marcus's guilt. The incident had been recorded from multiple angles and witnessed by dozens of people. The question was how the court would respond and what kind of sentence would be imposed. Mr. Thompson, Magistrate Hartwell said, her voice carrying the authority of the court, you are charged with assault under Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988. Specifically, that on October 15, 2025, at Buckingham Palace, you did unlawfully assault James Morrison, a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard, by throwing an object at him. How do you plead? Marcus stood up shakily, his voice barely audible as he spoke the words his solicitor had coached him to say, guilty, Your Honor. The plea sent a murmur through the small crowd of observers. Pleading guilty would likely result in a reduced sentence, but it also meant that Marcus was accepting full responsibility for his actions and their consequences. There would be no trial, no opportunity to argue that the incident had been misunderstood or blown out of proportion. Prosecutor David Sterling, representing the Crown, stood to address the court about the seriousness of the offense. Sterling was known for his methodical approach to cases involving attacks on public officials, and he prepared thoroughly for this hearing. Your Honor, Sterling began, this case involves an unprovoked attack on a member of the Queen's Guard while that individual was carrying out his official duties. The defendant, Marcus Thompson, was intoxicated when he threw a coffee cup at Guard Morrison, striking him in the chest and staining his uniform. This attack was witnessed by numerous tourists, including children, and was captured on multiple recording devices. Sterling paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the courtroom. The Queen's Guard represents not just military tradition, but the dignity and security of the monarchy itself. Attacks on Guard members, regardless of the weapon used or the extent of physical harm, represent an attack on British institutions and values. Mr. Thompson's action showed complete disregard for the law, for British customs, and for the personal dignity of Guard Morrison. Marcus listened to the prosecutor's words with growing horror. Hearing his actions described in such formal, legal terms made them seem so much worse than they had in his alcohol-clouded mind that morning at the palace. He'd thought of it as throwing away trash in frustration. The court was treating it as an assault on the British monarchy itself. His solicitor rose to respond, attempting to provide context for Marcus's actions without excusing them. Your Honor, my client deeply regrets his actions and wishes to apologize unreservedly to Guard Morrison, to the royal household, and to the court. Mr. Thompson was going through a difficult divorce and had consumed alcohol before the incident, which impaired his judgment significantly. Wells paused, referring to her notes. My client has no prior criminal record either in the United States or the United Kingdom. He is a software engineer with a steady employment history and has never been involved in any kind of violent or disruptive behavior before this incident. He recognizes that his actions were completely inappropriate and is prepared to accept the consequences and make amends however possible. Magistrate Hartwell listened to both presentations before addressing Marcus directly. Mr. Thompson, before I determine your sentence, I want to hear from you personally. Can you explain to the court what led to your decision to throw the coffee cup at Guard Morrison? Marcus stood again, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. This was his chance to explain himself, but he wasn't sure how to put into words the combination of factors that had led to his moment of terrible judgment. Your Honor, he began, his voice stronger than he'd expected, there's no excuse for what I did. I was drunk, I was angry about my divorce, and I was frustrated with everything that had been going wrong in my life. But none of that justifies attacking someone who was just doing his job. He paused, looking directly at the magistrate. I keep thinking about how I would feel if someone attacked me while I was at work, and it makes me sick to think that I did that to someone else. Guard Morrison was standing there with dignity and professionalism, and I responded by throwing garbage at him like he wasn't even human. I'm ashamed of myself and I'm sorry. The courtroom was quiet as Marcus sat down. His words had been simple but seemed genuine, carrying the weight of someone who had truly grasped the impact of his actions. Magistrate Hartwell consulted her notes and the sentencing guidelines before addressing the court. Mr. Thompson, assault is a serious offense, particularly when it involves an attack on a public official carrying out their duties. Your actions were witnessed by numerous people, including children, and showed a complete disregard for law and order. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. However, I note that you have pleaded guilty at the earliest opportunity, you have no prior criminal record, and you appear to show genuine remorse for your actions. I also take into account the personal difficulties you were experiencing, though these do not excuse your behavior. Marcus held his breath, waiting for the sentence that would determine his immediate future. I sentence you to a fine of £2,000, to be paid within 30 days, the magistrate announced. Additionally, you will perform 120 hours of community service to be completed within 6 months. You will also pay compensation of £500 to Guard Morrison for the damage to his uniform and the distress caused. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. No jail time meant he wouldn't be immediately deported, though he understood that his legal troubles were far from over. Furthermore, Magistrate Hartwell continued, I am issuing a restraining order preventing you from visiting any royal residences or properties for a period of 2 years. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. The magistrate's final words carried a warning that extended beyond the immediate case. Mr. Thompson, you have been extremely fortunate that your actions did not result in more serious charges or a custodial sentence. I hope you will use this experience as an opportunity to address whatever personal issues led to this incident and ensure that nothing like this happens again. As the court session concluded, Marcus felt overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and shame. The legal process was essentially over, but the real work of dealing with the consequences was just beginning. The story of his arrest had already appeared in several British newspapers and online publications, with headlines like American Tourist Attacks Queen's Guard and Drunk Yank Assaults Royal Guard at Palace. The media attention had been picked up by news outlets in the United States, including a Phoenix television station that had interviewed his former colleagues at work. His employer had placed him on unpaid leave pending the outcome of the legal proceedings, and he'd already received an email from HR suggesting that he might want to consider resigning rather than face termination. His ex-wife Sarah had called his sister Jenny after seeing the news coverage, not to offer support but to express her relief that they were no longer married. I always knew Marcus had anger problems, she'd told Jenny, but I never thought he'd do something this public and stupid. But, amid all the negative consequences, Marcus had also received unexpected support from some quarters. His sister had flown to London to be with him during the court proceedings, and several of his college friends had reached out to offer encouragement and help. Most surprisingly, he'd received a letter from Guard Morrison himself. The letter, forwarded through his solicitor, was brief but gracious. "Mr. Thompson, I accept your apology and hope that you are able to learn from this experience and move forward positively. Everyone makes mistakes, and I believe people should be judged by how they respond to their mistakes rather than the mistakes themselves. I wish you well in your future endeavors." Reading Morrison's letter in his hotel room that evening, Marcus broke down completely for the first time since the incident. The guard's forgiveness and humanity in the face of such disrespectful treatment highlighted just how badly Marcus had behaved and how much work he needed to do on himself. The community service assignment turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Marcus was assigned to work with a London homeless charity, helping to prepare and serve meals to people who had lost their housing due to addiction, mental illness, or economic hardship. The work was physically demanding and emotionally challenging, but it gave him perspective on his own problems and connected him with people who had overcome much greater obstacles than a messy divorce. Through his community service, Marcus met David Chen, a former investment banker who had lost everything due to gambling addiction and alcoholism but had rebuilt his life through treatment and service to others. David became an informal mentor to Marcus, helping him understand that his drinking had been a symptom of deeper issues with anger management, stress coping, and emotional regulation. "The alcohol didn't make you throw that cup," David explained during one of their conversations over coffee after a shift at the charity. "The alcohol just made it easier to do what part of you already wanted to do. Until you deal with the anger and the impulse control, you're going to keep having problems, alcohol or no alcohol." Marcus began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in London, initially just to satisfy the requirements of his community service but eventually because he found the structure and honesty of the program helpful. The process of taking inventory of his past behavior and making amends to people he'd hurt was difficult but necessary work that he'd been avoiding for years. 6 months later, as Marcus completed his final hours of community service, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that terrible morning at Buckingham Palace. He'd lost his job in Phoenix, but he'd found work with a London-based software company that was willing to overlook his criminal record in exchange for his skills and his obvious commitment to making amends for his past behavior. He'd started therapy to address his anger issues and had maintained his sobriety for over 4 months. His relationship with his sister had actually grown stronger through the crisis, and he'd even begun dating someone he'd met through his volunteer work at the homeless charity. The restraining order preventing him from visiting royal properties would remain in effect for another 18 months, but Marcus had no desire to return to Buckingham Palace anyway. The memory of his attack on Guard Morrison still filled him with shame, but he'd learned to use that shame as motivation for continued personal growth rather than an excuse for self-pity. On the anniversary of the incident, Marcus wrote a letter to Guard Morrison through the proper military channels. In it, he provided an update on his progress in addressing his personal issues and reiterated his sincere remorse for what had happened. He also announced that he would be making an annual donation to a military charity in Morrison's honor as a way of continuing to make amends for his actions. The letter he received back was brief but meaningful. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for your update and for the positive changes you have made in your life. Your commitment to growth and service is evident, and I respect the work you have done to address the issues that led to our unfortunate encounter. I wish you continued success in your recovery and your new life in London." Standing in his small London flat, reading Morrison's second letter, Marcus realized that the worst moment of his life had also become the catalyst for the most important changes he'd ever made. The coffee cup he'd thrown in anger had destroyed his old life completely, but it had also created space for him to build something better, something more honest and sustainable than what he'd had before. He still faced challenges, rebuilding his career, maintaining his sobriety, continuing to work on his anger and impulse control. But, for the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was moving in the right direction, taking responsibility for his actions rather than blaming others for his problems. The drunk American tourist who had attacked the Queen's Guard was gone, replaced by someone who was working every day to be worthy of the second chance he'd been given.